"That smoke is your family," the Nazi soldier told me, with the coldness of someone pointing at the sky, as if describing the weather forecast. I was only 16 years old. 16, an age when perhaps one should be concerned with studies, with a first love, with the future. But on that platform, surrounded by screams, dogs, and marching boots, the future already seemed like a concept that did not exist. I stood motionless, trying to understand those chimneys that spat out ash night and day, as if the sky itself was weeping for what we were losing. There was no room for questions, no strength left to cry, only silence inside me, a silence heavier than the cries that filled the air. Moments earlier, I had still been holding my mother's hand. I believed that somehow she would be able to protect me. I remember the pressure of her fingers around my wrist, as if trying to keep the pieces of an entire life together in one desperate grip. But in that pitiless selection, hands were torn from other hands. Eyes searched for eyes one last time. I saw my mother being led to one side, and I was pushed to another. The last image I have of her was not a smile or a word. It was the desperate gesture of her arms stretched out, trying to reach me again, while a sea of soldiers pulled me farther away. And then I understood. The smoke was all that would remain. The people around me were no longer people. They were a nameless crowd. Bodies stumbling against one another. Wide eyes that seemed to already stare beyond life itself. The air was filled with an acrid smell, a mix of fear and ashes. The barking of dogs was louder than the sound of breathing. I tried to absorb every detail, because something inside me, even without knowing it, knew this had to be remembered. It felt as though my memory was the only place where my family could keep existing. In that cruel instant, I realized I was alone. My mother, my grandparents, my uncles, everyone had disappeared into that smoke. The only inheritance I had left was an emptiness burning in my chest, and the duty to survive. But surviving there was not simply about breathing. It was resisting every minute, every random decision of life or death made by the flick of an officer's finger. It was walking with an empty stomach, with bones that no longer seemed to hold, and still keeping the heart beating as if saying I am still alive was the greatest act of defiance against a machine trying to erase me. And that is how my story found itself in that place. Auschwitz, the camp that sought to turn us into ash, also turned me into memory. And now, as I speak, every word is an attempt to rebuild what should never have been destroyed. Because if today I can use my voice, it is to tell not only how I lost an entire family in an afternoon of smoke, but how, against all odds, I learned to live carrying their remembrance. I was born in São Paulo in 1928, the son of Hungarian Jewish immigrants who had crossed the ocean in search of peace. My parents carried more than clothes in their suitcases. They brought centuries of traditions, prayers whispered in Hebrew, and the hope that Brazil would be a land of new beginnings. I grew up between two languages, the Portuguese of São Paulo's streets and the Hungarian that echoed through the walls of our home, seasoned with Yiddish words when my parents didn't want me to understand something important. São Paulo in the 1930s was a world of possibilities for a curious boy. I remember the humid heat, the noise of the streetcars, the smell of coffee that seemed to permeate every corner. On Sundays, my father would take me to the municipal market, where the colors of the fruits competed with the vendors' shouts. It was a simple life, but complete. We had enough, and enough seemed to be everything. But when I was just a young boy, my mother made a decision that would change everything. Concerned about my education and wanting me to know our roots, She decided I should spend some time in Hungary with relatives. "It will be good for you," she said, adjusting my clothes before the trip. "You need to know where we come from. What was meant to be temporary became permanent. Family and financial matters kept me there, under the care of uncles and grandparents. Hungary was a different world, but no less welcoming at first. Budapest had an ancient beauty that São Paulo didn't possess. Buildings that seemed to tell stories, bridges over the Danube, snow that transformed everything into a postcard. I adapted quickly, as children do. Soon I was speaking Hungarian fluently, playing with cousins, attending the local school. Life had a comforting routine. Studies in the morning, games in the afternoon, family dinners where my grandmother served steaming goulash while my grandfather told stories of the old world. For years, I lived this double life without conflict. I was Brazilian by birth, Hungarian by upbringing, Jewish by heritage. 3 identities that coexisted peacefully within me. I had friends at school, reasonable grades, even a teenage crush on a neighborhood girl who never knew my name. At 15, my biggest problems were math tests and deciding what profession to pursue. But the world around us was changing, and the signs came like drops before the storm. First were the whispered conversations of adults when they thought we weren't listening. Then, the newspaper headlines my grandfather read with an increasingly furrowed brow. Hitler, Reich, Nuremberg laws. Words that sounded distant but approached like shadows. Anti-Semitism didn't arrive all at once. It infiltrated. One day, the grocery store owner who always greeted me began to ignore me. Another day, I was barred from entering the cinema where I always went. "It's no longer allowed," said the doorman, without looking me in the eye. At school, friends of years began sitting far away, as if being Jewish were contagious. The world was narrowing, door by door, glance by glance. 1944 arrived like a final blow. I was 16 and still believed things would improve, that it was just a bad phase in history. But one March morning, the illusion ended. The sound still echoes in my memory. Fists pounding on the door, voices in German shouting orders. When my grandfather opened it, soldiers invaded our home as if we were long-sought criminals. "You have 1 hour to pack 1 suitcase each. Only essentials." The officer's voice was mechanical, emotionless. My grandmother trembled as she tried to decide what fit into essential. For an entire lifetime, my grandfather packed his prayer book. I took a family photo and the most recent letter from my mother in Brazil. I didn't know I would never receive another. We were taken first to a temporary ghetto, then to the train station. The platform was crowded with Jews from all over the city, entire families, from babies to elderly who could barely walk. Despair had a smell. Sweat, fear, held back tears. When the train arrived, they weren't passenger cars. They were cattle cars, with small barred openings at the top. "Get in, quickly, schnell." The soldiers pushed us as if we really were cattle. 80, 90, maybe 100 people squeezed into a space made for transporting animals. There was barely room to sit. The air became thin within minutes. A woman fainted, and there was no way to lay her down. Children cried, but the sound was muffled by the mass of bullets. The train departed, and with it our last connection to the known world. Through the gaps, we could see the Hungarian landscape passing by. Fields, villages, normal lives continuing while ours were being transported to the unknown. Day and night lost meaning in that car. The thirst was torturous, hunger hurt, but worse was not knowing where we were going. Some prayed, others had given up even praying. I don't know how many days the journey lasted. Time is different when you're suspended between life and something worse. But when the train finally stopped and the doors opened, the cold, polished air entered like a slap. "Rouse! Rouse! Get out! Get out!" The guards shouted, stumbling over each other. We fell onto the platform. That's when I saw the sign, Auschwitz, and above us, the chimneys releasing that smoke that never stopped, day and night, as if hell itself had found an address on earth. The wagon doors opened, and daylight wounded my eyes like blades. After days in suffocating darkness, that brightness seemed unreal. But there was no time to adjust my vision. The screaming began immediately. "Raus! Raus! Schnell!" The guards pulled us, pushed us. Some fell and were trampled. The chaos was total. Dogs barked, children cried, and everywhere there were uniforms, weapons, voices in German that sounded more like barking. It was then that I saw, for the first time, what would be my world for the next months. Endless rows of barbed wire, watchtowers with machine guns pointed downward, searchlights that swept every corner, and the barracks. Long wooden structures that extended as far as the eye could see, as if someone had decided to build an entire city dedicated to suffering. The main gate had an iron inscription, "Arbeit matched frei." Work sets you free. The greatest lie ever forged in metal. On the platform, the process I didn't yet understand began immediately. But it would determine who would live another day and who would die that afternoon. An SS officer, impeccably uniformed, pointed with his finger or with the cane he carried. Right or left, life or death, simple as that. I saw families being separated in seconds. Mothers torn from children, husbands from wives. The screams were heartrending, but the guards kept pushing, separating, as if dividing cattle for slaughter. When my turn came, the officer examined me for no more than 2 seconds. I was 16 years old, looked strong enough to work. A movement of the cane right. I didn't know it yet, but that casual gesture had spared me from the gas chambers, at least that day. My grandparents went to the left. I tried to follow them, but a guard pushed me back with his rifle butt. "Move," he shouted. It was the last time I saw them. Later, I would understand that they probably didn't survive that first afternoon. We were taken to a barrack where they ordered us to remove all our clothes. Modesty, dignity, everything had to be abandoned right there. Men with hair clippers shaved our heads to the scalp. Then came the showers. Freezing water that seemed more like punishment than cleaning. Finally, they threw at us striped clothes that reeked of disinfectant and death. Pants that didn't fit. Torn shirts, shoes, when there were any, that didn't match. In minutes, we had ceased to be people and become numbers. They tattooed my forearm. The needle penetrated the skin over and over, engraving the digits that would be my only identity from then on. The pain was sharp, but worse was understanding the meaning. I was no longer Andor Stern. I was just a number in the camp's inventory, a replaceable item. The barrack where I was assigned was a nightmare of wood and compressed humanity. 3-tier bunks, sometimes 4, where 2 or 3 people slept on each level. The smell was unbearable. Sweat, urine, feces, disease, and death, all mixed in an atmosphere that burned the nostrils. There were no mattresses, just wooden planks and, if you were lucky, a bit of straw. A thin blanket to share between 2 or 3. while the polished cold penetrated through the cracks in the walls. The routine began before dawn. A bell rang at 4 in the morning, and we had minutes to get out of the bunks and form lines outside, no matter if it was snowing or raining. Roll call. The apple could last hours. We stood at attention while the guards counted and recounted. If someone had died during the night, the body had to be present for the count. I saw men holding corpses upright so the numbers would match. Breakfast was dark water they called coffee, served in metal bowls that were never washed, half a liter at most. Lunch, a thin soup where unidentifiable pieces floated, potato peels, if we were lucky. In the evening, a piece of bread hard as stone, maybe 200 grams, sometimes with a spoonful of rancid margarine, or a microscopic piece of sausage. That was all the food to sustain men who worked 12, 14 hours a day in forced labor. The work was designed to kill, carrying stones from one side to another for no purpose whatsoever, digging ditches that would be filled the next day only to be dug again, building roads under the scorching summer sun or in winter snow without adequate clothing. The capos, prisoners who supervised other prisoners, were often crueler than the SS guards themselves. A slow pace, a stumble, a moment of weakness could mean a brutal beating or worse. I saw men give up. There was a term for it in the camp. Muslim. They were the ones who lost the will to live, who stopped fighting. You could see it in their eyes when it happened, a light that went out. They stopped eating the little food they received, stopped washing, stopped talking. In days, sometimes weeks, they were dead. And there were those who ran to the electrified fences, choosing a quick death over the slow agony of the camp. The smell of death was everywhere, but especially coming from the crematorium chimneys. That smoke the soldier had mentioned upon arrival. It never stopped. Day and night, the chimneys spat out the ashes of the dead. Sometimes, when the wind changed direction, the ashes fell on us like macabre snow. Ashes that had been people, mothers, fathers, children, perhaps my own grandparents. The selections continued regularly. Without warning, guards would storm the barracks. Everyone out, undressed. We formed lines, and the camp doctor, if you can call someone who so completely violated the Hippocratic oath that would pass by examining, too thin, selected wounds that wouldn't heal. Selected, persistent cough. Selected. Sometimes the selection seemed completely arbitrary, based on the officer's mood that day. I quickly learned the tricks of survival. Pinching my cheeks before a selection to look healthier. Standing erect even when my legs trembled with exhaustion. Never showing illness. Never drawing attention. Becoming invisible was an art. Being noticed could be fatal. The nights were worse than the days. In the darkness of the barrack, the sounds of human suffering created a symphony from hell. Moans of pain, coughs that wouldn't stop, fever, delirium, muffled crying, men calling for their mothers in a dozen different languages. And always, the creaking of the bunks when someone moved, trying to find a less painful position on the hard planks. It was on one of those nights, perhaps a month after arrival, that reality hit me with full force. Lying in the bunk, listening to the labored breathing of the man beside me who probably wouldn't see dawn, I understood with crystal clarity. I was completely alone. My family had disappeared in that smoke. My grandparents, uncles, cousins, all turned to ashes. In Brazil, my mother didn't even know if I was alive. There was no one in the entire world who knew where I was or cared if I would live another day. The loneliness was heavier than hunger, more painful than cold. It was a void that consumed from within, an absence that screamed louder than any sound in the camp. That night, for the first time since arrival, I allowed the tears to fall. Silent tears, because showing weakness was dangerous even in the dark. I cried for everything I had lost, for everything I would never have again, for the childhood that had ended so abruptly on that train platform. But something strange happened on that night of absolute despair. In the depths of that loneliness, I found a small flame of determination. If I was all that remained of my family, then I had to survive. Not for me, but for them. So someone would remember their names, their faces, their stories. So the world would know they had existed. I will survive, I whispered in the dark, the words almost inaudible, even to me. I will get out of here, and I will tell what I saw. It was an impossible promise, made in a place where promises meant nothing, but it was all I had. And in the months that would follow, it would be this promise, whispered in the dark, that would keep me fighting when everything else told me to give up. Time in Auschwitz was not measured in days or weeks. It was measured by roll calls, by bowls of watery soup, by endless marches. Each morning, when I opened my eyes on the wooden bunk, there was always a moment of hesitation. I was still alive. Nothing was guaranteed. And yet, there I was, breathing in a place built to turn us into smoke. In that absence of certainty, I had to learn the strangest art of all. Surviving in the midst of death. Work began early. The siren, harsh as the freezing dawn, woke the shrunken bodies, most of them skeletons, wrapped in thinning skin. We had minutes to rush outside, line up in the yard, and be ready for counting, always long, often cruel. Then they sent us 2 different jobs, carrying stones, stacking bricks, digging holes that would be filled the next day just to be dug again. None of it had any purpose. The work was part of the machinery of annihilation, to break the body, crush the spirit, eliminate the excess slowly. The stones we carried weighed more than the arms that tried to hold them. After hours, the body refused to continue. Legs trembled, the chest burned, every muscle screamed. Yet there we were, forced to march under the watchful eyes of guards, with dogs trained to attack at the first sign of weakness. You could not collapse. Those who fell rarely rose again. I saw men drop to the ground and never get back up, beaten until their final breath, or simply left behind like discarded cargo. I was 16, but within months I had aged decades. My bones pushed through the skin, my ribs were visible. The striped uniform hung from me like rags on a pole. But inside, something still resisted. That silent resistance was what made me stand up every morning, even when my strength betrayed me. To resist, I had to create strategies. Some were simple: pinching my cheeks before a selection, forcing my posture upright even when my body wanted to collapse, walking as firmly as I could during inspections. Other strategies lived only in the mind. Whenever despair tried to paralyze me, I clung to memories. My mother's face in Snow Palo, smiling as she set bread on the table. The smell of goulash in my grandmother's Hungarian kitchen. The rattle of streetcars echoing through the city. These fragments of life became secret fuel. In those moments when I thought I would give in, I repeated to myself, I cannot disappear here. I must see what comes after. I must tell. The camp taught me that survival meant more than enduring hunger, cold, and labor. It meant believing my life still carried meaning. Many perished not only because their bodies failed, but because inside they no longer saw a reason to breathe. That was exactly what the Nazis wanted. Not just to kill us, but to erase every spark of humanity. And it was then that I discovered the vow that carried me forward. Surviving meant carrying those who couldn't. There were days when the fear of the selections became unbearable. Without warning, guards would burst in shouting ales, heroes, everyone outside. Naked, we were lined up, observed by doctors. With the tilt of a head or the flick of a hand, they decided who would keep working and who would fall to the ground that day. A finger pointing left could mean the gas chambers. Seconds of examination decided entire destinies. Each time our numbers were called, the heart turned to stone. Is it me this time? In those moments, my existence depended entirely on the mood of a man in uniform. I never grew used to this roulette of death, but I learned to hide my terror. My gaze fixed forward, no trembling. I slapped color into my face. When I was chosen to live another day, the relief was poisoned with guilt, because others had been left behind. You never forgot their eyes at that instant, staring back at you as if pleading, "Don't let us disappear." And so, their silent cries joined my own promise to endure. And sometimes, in the darkness of those nights, there were miracles of humanity. A chunk of bread split in half, and I would realize the other had kept the smaller piece, just so I might have a little more strength. A companion who held my arm as I staggered on the march back to the barrack, whispering my name like a prayer. These minor acts gave me more strength than any soup. They were proof that even here, the human spirit could still push through cracks in the walls of hell. Once, I became gravely ill. Cold and hunger turned my body fragile, and fever burned me from within. I could barely rise from the bunk's wooden plank. I knew that if I showed myself weak at the next roll call, I would likely be sent away. 4 nights I shook, struggling to hide my condition. The man in the bunk beside me, who barely had enough for himself, pulled part of his thin blanket over me. He divided nothing into 2. "Hold on," he rasped, almost without a voice. "Hold on. I don't know his name. Perhaps I never did, but I remember his warm hand over mine. And that touch lived proof that not even Auschwitz could erase everything human. I recovered, barely. But the mark of that illness and that gesture became eternal. It was in moments like this, flirting with death itself, that I understood what the true dividing line was. Not just to stop breathing, but to stop remembering, to stop believing. That's when I knew, deep inside, I would resist for all those who no longer could. On one of the coldest days I can recall, as we hauled endless loads of rocks, my legs gave out. For a second, my body surrendered to the ground. I saw the snow in front of me and thought, so I began to see the camp as a test with no pause. Each day was an examination fail, and you were erased. My body was no longer mine. It was like an old wagon dragged to breaking point, but my mind still belonged to me. And inside it lived a secret. Inside me still lived Snow Paulo, my father, my mother, the laughter of cousins in a Budapest living room, the smell of fresh bread. These tiny windows were fortresses against oblivion. It was in this terrible paradox that I learned the essence of survival in Auschwitz. It wasn't enough to eat, to drink, to march. One had to invent reasons to go on. I had mine, to tell this story one day. That silent promise, to bear witness, became my invisible shield against the cold, against hunger, against death that walked beside us every single day. That vow was what kept me fighting when everything else told me to surrender. Sleeping in Auschwitz was nothing more than collapsing into unconsciousness from exhaustion. But on that dawn in 1945, something felt different. The silence was strange. There were no usual rhythms of boots, no shouted orders cutting through the air. I didn't know it yet, but the war was reaching its end, and with it the empire of death that had kept us imprisoned. In the days before, I had noticed unusual movements. Guards looked less confident. There were nervous glances, hurried conversations in German we couldn't fully grasp, but the tone alone made it clear. Something was changing. Some guards slipped away quietly, without announcement. Their overwhelming presence, which had once defined every second of our lives, suddenly began to thin out. For those of us who no longer expected anything, this was more confusing than comforting. Absence could be just as threatening as their presence. Hunger had left my body in ruins. I weighed barely 30 kilos, about 60 pounds. Every bone jutted out under my skin. Walking was dragging myself. Breathing hurt. I was only 17. But looking at my hands, swollen, skeletal, aged with sores, I saw the hands of an old man. Many around me could no longer rise from the bunks. Others, feverish and delirious, mumbled incoherent words until they fell silent forever. Death had always been a constant shadow, but now it seemed to hover at the gates, uncertain of what to do next. And then one cold morning, we heard a new sound. Not the barking of German orders, nor the snapping of dogs. It was different. The rumble of engines, scattered gunfire, distant explosions. The front was approaching, and suddenly an even deeper silence fell. The guards who had remained were gone. Only we were left, the survivors inside that territory of barbed wire, smoke, and ash. And then, in a moment I will never forget, the gates opened. Soldiers of the Red Army stepped in. They did not arrive like some cinematic redemption, banners waving, smiles triumphant. They were weary men, hardened by war, advancing with weapons ready because they still didn't know what to expect. When they saw us, they froze. I saw it in their eyes. It wasn't prisoners they were looking at, but walkings. We, the survivors, did not run to freedom. We had no strength to run. Some tried to wave, others only stared, stunned. I remember the feeling of not knowing if what I was seeing was real, or if my feverish mind was inventing an illusion to soothe itself in the final hours. The soldiers offered us food and water, but even that was dangerous. Many of my fellow prisoners devoured the bread desperately, and their broken bodies could not handle it. For some, liberation was also their last breath. I myself held that piece of bread like it was a jewel, but I chewed carefully, fearfully, as if my life depended on every bite. It wasn't just food. It was confirmation that something had changed. I remember shuffling toward the open gates, leaning on a piece of wood because my legs barely worked. The cold, polished air stung my face. Yet, it felt different. For the first time in almost a year, the air was not heavy with the smell of the crematorium chimneys. That morning, there was no smoke. The sky was gray, but clear. I took a deep breath and felt something unfamiliar, as if I were breathing for the first time in my entire life. Beyond the barbed wire lay snow-covered fields. The vastness stretched endlessly, but it did not bring relief. It only deepened the emptiness. The question cut through me like a blade. And now, where to? For whom? There was no one waiting on the other side. No family calling my name. No arms ready to embrace me. Yes, I had survived, but like someone who stumbles out of a fire only to find silence on the other side. What did freedom mean without those who had given me life? The camp had stolen my family, and with them it had stolen my youth, my innocence, my sense of belonging. I remember walking a few steps past the gate and stopping. I was free. But I didn't know if I had the strength to endure that freedom. Survival weighed heavier than death because it carried obligation. To keep breathing meant carrying the memory of all those who could not. In the following days, the chaos only grew. Some who had endured until liberation now collapsed and died, as if their bodies had waited only to let go. After hope arrived, doctors arrived, doing what they could, but it was never enough. Soldiers gave us clothes and blankets, anything they could spare. But there were no parents, no siblings, no voices calling my name in reassurance. At night, I curled into silence and discovered that what had been taken from me was not only family, but my very place in the world. To this day, I carry the memory of that first day of freedom. The contrast of dirty polished snow against the sound of gates swinging open. I did not cheer. I did not cry with joy. I only breathed deeply, painfully, and understood that breathing could be both miracle and curse. Many speak of liberation as an ending. For me, it was a beginning of disorientation, of wounds that wouldn't heal, of walking without ground under my feet. I was free, yes, free to discover that I no longer had anywhere to return to. And in that moment, standing before the open gates of Auschwitz, I realized a truth that has echoed through my life. Freedom carries scars, and mine would remain with me forever. The ship that brought me back to Brazil sailed slowly, as if it carried more than passengers. It carried ghosts. I stood on the deck, staring at the endless ocean, trying to process what it meant to return. I was not the same boy who had left years before. That boy had been buried somewhere between Sao Paulo and Auschwitz. What returned was a 17-year-old survivor, with the face and body of an old man and memories no youth should ever bear. When the port of Santos came into view on the horizon, my chest tightened. Brazil home, but a home without family is nothing more than an address. I disembarked with a borrowed suitcase and donated clothes. Everything I owned could be carried in 2 hands, except the memories. Those overflowed. Sao Paulo greeted me with its familiar chaos, the clanging of the trams. Portuguese shouted across the streets, the smell of coffee lingering on every corner. But I walked those streets like a ghost. People rushed past me, busy with their ordinary lives, while I carried Auschwitz invisibly on my shoulders. How could I explain to someone buying bread at the bakery that I had seen people die for a crust of bread? How could I tell them that the smoke rising from factory chimneys made me tremble because I remembered other chimneys, other smoke? Those first months were a different kind of survival. Not against starvation or freezing nights anymore. Now against emptiness. Distant relatives took me in kindly, but kindness could not fill the hole left by my family. At night, while Sao Paulo slept, I lay awake listening to silence. Silence crowded with voices that would never answer again. I had to relearn everything. How to eat without desperate haste. How to sleep without fear of not waking. How to trust that my bedroom door could remain open without danger. My body, which had arrived weighing little more than 30 kilos, slowly regained its human shape. But inside, The wounds stayed raw. Then I met Miriam. She worked in a fabric shop in Bomratero, and our eyes crossed by chance. There was something in hers, not pity, but understanding. She too was the daughter of immigrants. She too carried stories of loss, although nothing like mine. We spoke first of trivial things, later of life itself. Never of Auschwitz. Not in the beginning. That was a subject I kept locked away, fearing that if I opened it, it would consume me. We married in a simple ceremony. When I placed the ring on her hand, I thought of my mother, of how much she would have loved to be there. Miriam squeezed my fingers and whispered, "They are here, in your heart." For the first time in years, I cried, not from despair, but from a mixture of sadness and gratitude I cannot name. We built a life together. We had children, first a boy, then a girl. Each birth was a silent victory against those who had tried to annihilate my bloodline. Whenever I held my newborn babies, I thought, you exist because I survived. You are the living answer to a project of death. But the nights remained cruel. Nightmares visited without warning. I was back in the camp, standing in the selection line, watching the smoke rise. I woke drenched in sweat, my heart racing, and Miriam held me until my breathing calmed. She never complained about the broken nights, the sudden cries, the moments when I was absent even while sitting beside her. For years I tried to keep Auschwitz silent. I thought words would reopen wounds too deep to bear. But silence has its own weight. Silence risks agreeing with oblivion, and oblivion risks allowing repetition. Slowly, I understood. I had not survived only for myself. I survived to speak for those who could not. The first time I spoke publicly was in a Jewish school. They asked me to tell my story to teenagers. I hesitated. How could I translate horror into words young people could bear without breaking? But then I thought, if not me, who? If not now, when? The survivors were aging. Soon, none of us would remain. I walked onto that small stage with my knees trembling more than on the day I last marched out of Auschwitz. I looked at their young faces, full of life, and began. My name is Andor Stern. I was your age when I was taken to Auschwitz. The silence in the auditorium was unlike any other silence I had known. It was a silence of deep listening. I spoke for an hour about the cattle car, about the arrival, about the smoke. When I finished, many were crying. A girl raised her hand. "Mr. Stern, how were you able to forgive?" I answered honestly, I did not forgive. But I decided not to let hate consume me. I chose to use my life to ensure this would never be forgotten. After that first time, other invitations followed: schools, universities, community centers. Each talk was like tearing a piece of myself and offering it to the world. It hurt, but it was pain with purpose. I began to notice faces in the crowd, children of immigrants, grandchildren of survivors, young Brazilians with no direct connection to the Holocaust, yet leaving transformed. That was when I decided to write. Spoken words vanish, but written ones remain. Uma estrela na escuridão, a star in the darkness, was born out of sleepless nights, out of memories that refused to die, out of a desperate need to leave a permanent testimony. Every chapter was a battle against forgetting, against the pain of remembering, against the temptation to soften the truth. The book was not only about horror, it was about the endurance of the human soul, about how even in the darkest place, small sparks of humanity appeared, about the piece of bread shared, the hand that lifted me up when I fell. about the vow whispered in the dark to survive, so I could tell. When the book was published, letters began to arrive. Survivors who saw their own stories in mine. Children and grandchildren who finally understood their parents' silences. Teachers who used it in classrooms. Each letter confirmed my voice was not alone. There was a chorus of memory rising. Perhaps the most powerful moment came in a public school on the outskirts of Sao Paulo. A thin boy with sharp eyes asked me, "Sir, what does this have to do with me?" I looked at him and answered, "It has everything to do with you. Because when we allow one group to be dehumanized, we open the door for any group to be next." My story is a warning. Hatred does not choose only one victim. It devours them all. The years passed. My children grew, had children of their own. Each grandchild was another victory against those who had tried to erase us. As time went on, I also lost fellow survivors. With each passing, a piece of our living archive disappeared. The urgency grew heavier. Time was running out. I intensified the talks, the interviews. I accepted every invitation, even when my body protested. Miriam came with me, holding my hand when words faltered. She became the guardian of my memory, ensuring that even after I was gone, the story would live. Today, when I look back, I see my life had two births, one in Sao Paulo in 1928 and another in Auschwitz in 1945. When I walked out of those gates, the first gave me life. The second gave me purpose. Every word I speak, every young face that listens, every tear shed in my talks is another stone in the memorial I build with my own existence. The scars remain. Not only the scars on my starved, fragile body, but above all the invisible scars, the memories, the absences, the endless weight of what I witnessed. Yet I have learned that scars, too, can be maps. They show where we have been and remind us why we must go on. And so, I continue. Not for myself. My life has already been lived. I continue for them, for all those who turned into smoke through those cursed chimneys. I continue for the young who look at me in disbelief and who carry into the future the weight of memory. I continue because I know somewhere someone is saying it never happened, and my voice is living proof that it did. When my time comes, and it will, as it comes for all, I will leave knowing I honored my promise. The promise I whispered in the dark of Auschwitz, to survive so I could tell. I have told, and I will keep telling, until my last breath. I survived for them, so that no one could ever say it didn't happen, so that smoke would never be forgotten. That is my final victory over Auschwitz, to transform ashes into memory, silence into testimony, death into a commitment to life. As long as someone remembers, as long as someone tells, as long as someone is outraged, the Nazis will never have won completely. And that is the only revenge I allow myself, to live, to remember, to teach, until the end.